Hello and welcome to Insight. I'm Natasha Shabhaskar. Prime Minister Narendra Modi became the first Indian Prime Minister since Indira Gandhi to visit Manila, the capital of Philippines, in 36 years. He is in Manila for a 3-day visit to attend the ASEAN, India and East Asia summits that's expected to boost trade and defense cooperation. The ASEAN, Association of Southeast Asian Nations region, including India, comprises a combined population of 1.85 billion people, one-fourth of the global population.
Prime Minister Narendra Modi is on a 3-day visit to Philippines to attend the ASEAN, India and East Asia summits, where he is likely to reassert India's push for crafting a global approach to deal with growing challenge of terrorism and radicalization. Focus of deliberations will also be on steps to boost regional trade. The thorny issues of China's aggressive military maneuver in the disputed South China Sea, North Korea's nuclear missile tests, and overall security architecture in the region is also likely to come up for discussion. On the sidelines of the main events, Prime Minister Modi is likely to have a series of bilateral meetings with a number of leaders, including US President Donald Trump, Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, and Russian Premier Dmitry Medvedev. The ties between India and ASEAN have been on an upswing in the last few years, with focus being on ramping up cooperation in the areas of trade and investment as well as security and defense. While ASEAN Summit is likely to focus more on trade and investment related issues, leaders at the East Asia Summit are expected to delve deep into issues relating to maritime security, terrorism, non-proliferation and migration. Apart from the 10 ASEAN member states, East Asia Summit includes India, China, Japan, Republic of Korea, Australia, New Zealand, the United States and Russia. The ASEAN region, along with India, together comprises combined population of 1.85 billion people, which is one-fourth of the global population, and their combined GDP has been estimated at over $3.8 trillion. India sees a lot of potential in its relation with the ASEAN region.
Right, so India sees a lot of potential with its engagement with the ASEAN region. So our focus today ASEAN India Summit, the fact that this is a Prime Minister's visit to Philippines after 36 long years, how important this is?
I think if you look at the context, the entire Southeast Asian region is going through some kind of a change. After the end of the Vietnam War in the 70s, after the 80s, East Asia had tremendous prosperity and tremendous progress because the whole security and everything was underpinned by the American presence. But now new uncertainties are coming. First, of course, is President Trump's own predilections and uncertainties introduced by his own beliefs and convictions. Then the rise of China, everybody is wary of China.
Right.
And nobody knows which way it is going, and there are a lot of unstated anxieties in the minds of all the 10 ASEAN countries. Then yesterday, the inaugural speech, or today of President Duterte, he really emphasized on the radicalization of the region, and that is a new element which is coming. The East Asia has been free of any kind of very strong radicalization, terrorism, only in some pockets of Indonesia.
Right.
So that is a new challenge which is coming. So in that context, Prime Minister, we have our own great misgivings on terrorism and radicalization, and the entire Look East policy or Act East policy is also for economic integration, economic engagement with the East, and how trade and investment can be a boost for our own economic prosperity and for the prosperity of ASEAN region. So the agenda is very heavy. Lot of work has been done, but much more needs to be done.
Okay.
and all that will be
The
discussed.
agenda is very heavy, boosting trade, defense cooperation, looking also at maritime security through the East Asia Forum. Simultaneously, also the bigger focus, of course, for India will be how to address and craft a global strategy on terrorism and extremism. Now, Dr. Uttam, why this meet becomes very, very important at a time when we are also celebrating 50 years of ASEAN?
Yeah. Actually, now the Asia, as Ambassador Tayal has said, is in a very different trajectory. There are two competing visions, one promoted by China and the other advanced by the United States of America. And one vision is based on the geoeconomics, and China till date was almost promoting that vision with the peaceful rise. However, recent events in South China Sea, in Doklam, and also threat to Korea to retaliate against the installation of the THAAD missile system. So seeing this, China's earlier era projection that Asia is a win-win story, intra-Asian trade, investment, and all this grew very rapidly, and everybody was content. But suddenly the shift in the Chinese behavior is very alarming. However, the US, the vision of the US for East Asia rests on the San Francisco Treaty, where a trilateral arrangement between US, Japan, and Korea was able to hold East Asian balance of power. However, rise of China has made that San Francisco system irrelevant. And also Korea is deviating between China and the US, and it's a little bit confusing right now where Korea stands. So considering this, how India sees Asia, because being with the US, India is now moving towards geopolitics. However, the geoeconomics promoted by the Beijing may be more lucrative.
Okay, now that's an interesting point, geopolitics versus geoeconomics. And geoeconomics, let's not forget, after OBOR, the way countries have responded. But then there's also the checkbook diplomacy, which we have seen from the China's side, and the way countries have suffered because of that sort of debt trap. Let's not forget Sri Lanka, Maldives are actually a case in point. But your assessment, what ASEAN has achieved so far? Because for any assessment of the potential of ASEAN can only be, wisely explained if we assess that what ASEAN has achieved in last 50 years. What's your assessment on that?
I think, as Ambassador Tayal had said, ASEAN, the very compact has contributed substantially in the kind of growth and the prosperity that we have seen in this region, which was, as all the participating countries say, it would have been unimaginable otherwise, primarily because of connectivity, which has been formidable between all these countries. Secondly, the trade, which has really bounced. I mean, if you look at even our trade with the ASEAN, is about $76 to $80 billion, which is substantial. And intra-ASEAN trade is also really very good. And they have all benefited also with the rise of China, which is something that remains unspoken. But the fact of the matter is China's phenomenal growth has contributed to the region also, enjoying this kind of bounce. So in a certain way, if you look at it, the major gain has been, rise in wealth, rise in prosperity, rise in the, the entire region economically has lifted. I mean, we would not talk so much about Myanmar, which is still a laggard in certain ways, but other countries have done rather well. So if you want to ask in only simple terms, is prosperity. But the other things that have begun to come up primarily are the issue of security, which wasn't there earlier so much. People have begun to talk about Islamic radicalism, especially after what has happened in Philippines. You had some areas which have been under their control. And there's been a great amount of engagement between the ASEAN countries to counter Islamic radicalism. So if you look at it, it's economics, which has been a major driver. Secondly, now is security. And the third thing that has been talked about quite a bit in this summit, and has been a legacy even of the earlier summit, is the freedom of navigation, which China keeps on questioning, and people are wondering whether the South China Sea, China has ownership or not, and you have other countries who keep questioning.
Okay.
So even this entire deliberation or conversation that is taking place in Manila, it is primarily about how China interfaces with the rest of the members, and how they see the South China Sea.
We'll focus specifically on China also, but if one has to understand, as Professor Uttam was mentioning earlier, that is this a new Asia? Is Prime Minister, when the fact that Prime Minister is in Philippines after 36 long years, the last visit was of Indira Gandhi. Are we now engaging with a new East Asia? What in your opinion is the new East Asian reality?
The new East Asian reality is a reality where the rest of the Asia is taking they're taking cognizance of China. They're trying to work out a strategy as to how to deal with China. And similarly, China is also reworking primarily with how it should deal with neighbors. It's at the time when all of them recognize that US is retreating. So in a certain way, a vacuum which has been created by US is sought to being filled up by China. And you have this phenomenon of President Donald Trump coming and attending the East Asia Summit, the APEC, and now the ASEAN summit, and you realize that save for a bit of bluster, there is not much impress that President Trump is going to really leave, because at the end of the day, most of the participating countries know they have to deal with China, and as you rightly put, they resort to checkbook diplomacy. They are pretty prompt when it comes to giving grants and loans, and they all recognize, most of the countries recognize that it's easy to deal with China when it comes to taking cash. Subsequently, there is a threat of debt trap, as we saw in case of Sri Lanka, but at the beginning, especially for economies which are struggling for cash, China is more than forthcoming than many of those consultants which are based in Washington.
This was very evident even post the Asian financial crisis. China actually bailed out the East Asian economies from the Asian financial crisis. We'll talk about that also. But Ambassador Tayal, your assessment, is Prime Minister Modi engaging with a very, very different East Asia today? And if one has to assess what ASEAN has really achieved in the last so many years?
ASEAN's biggest achievement is that it has provided a platform for the countries of the region and countries from outside the region which have an influence, which are active, to come together and exchange views, share concerns, and try to have some kind of a common strategy to deal with common challenges. Because in East Asia, that is the only East Asia Summit, or if you say ARF or ASEAN plus 6 or ASEAN plus 8. These are the only forum where all the countries come together. Otherwise, Africa has Organization, African Union, Organization of American States, EU, and all other organizations are there. And ASEAN has played this role successfully, and they have also piloted the economic growth of the region in harmony with the growth of other countries with which they are engaged with their dialogue partners, etc. But now they are coming to another stage, which is ASEAN Economic Community, ASEAN Political Community, ASEAN Community, and an economic integration, that is the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, where we have some reservations. Because in RCEP, we have always said that it should be a balanced outcome, whereas our interlocutors, whether it is because China is also there, and the 10 ASEAN members, they want India to open up our goods market, but they are not willing to open up their market for services and for investments, etc. Now, that is where there is some feeling among many ASEAN members that India is being little slow in coming to agreements, and that is a major challenge before Prime Minister Modi and his officials, to convince at the highest level that what are India's concerns, and we need a regional comprehensive economic partnership agreement which is balanced and which takes care of trade both in services and goods.
I think so you're saying there's a lot of possibilities as well as complexities when one talks about the challenges that exist with as far as our engagement with the ASEAN region is concerned. Next, when we come back, we'll also focus on the Quad dialogue that happened between officials of India, Australia, Japan, and the US, the potential there, and is this primarily to counter the aggressive China on the other side, and also what really distinguishes ASEAN as a region vis-a-vis SAARC as a grouping? Why SAARC hasn't achieved the same potential the way ASEAN has achieved on the other side? Stay tuned. Welcome back. You're watching Insight. 10 years ago, the proposal to have a quadrilateral security dialogue between US, India, Japan and Australia had been initiated by Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. India had also given its assent in principle, but Australia's Prime Minister at the time, Kevin Rudd, withdrew from the Quad, apparently in a bid not to provoke China. Australia's change of mind at the last moment has lingered in Indian institutional memory for a long time and also hampered Australian participation in the Malabar exercises. But as they say, some ideas are not easily forgotten. In the backdrop of China's growing assertiveness, India, the US, Japan and Australia have got together to revive an alliance called the Quadrilateral, and talks were held in Manila on the sidelines of the ASEAN summit. The grouping is expected to boost free trade and defense cooperation across parts of South China Sea and Indian Ocean, and is likely to see substantive cooperation among these countries on defense cooperation, maritime security and infrastructure development. So why the Quad arrangement is important? Is it a new reflection of the certain uncertainties and the changing geopolitical reality? Coming back to Professor Uttam, from where you actually started talking about the changing geopolitical reality, the Quad security dialogue clearly reflects that. What should be done to counter China in the region?
Yeah, I think the idea of Quad was mooted. Let's say 2007, and from that time till the whole decade, actually China was promoting geoeconomics, and thus this kind of talk of security cooperation was a mismatch. However, now seeing China's aggressive behavior, this is very important, and as the Beijing commented on this development,
right,
they told it's a first step towards forming of an Asian NATO.
Right.
So whether this is the reality, and if that's so, because US till date managed East Asian security by making bilateral or trilateral arrangement, but it was never in the form of an institution like
right,
NATO.
Right.
So whether US has that kind of commitment to build up an institutional mechanism to counter China.
Right. Now, could an Indo-Pacific Quad really counter China's aggression? Because that is a big question at this stage. Why it is created? Is it primarily to secure the Indo-Pacific region, or also the sort of debate and the aggression that exists in the South China Sea, where different countries have different interests, and specifically the sort of territorial claims even made by Japan, Australia, US, and India coming together? What sort of signaling is this?
I mean, obvious signaling is that you need to counter China, but I don't think India is still very ambivalent about being dragged into it. Because if you look at the three other participants of the Quad, US, Japan, Australia, their GDP, their level of attainment, economic attainment, and many other ways, they are in a different league altogether. And there is a point of view in the in our foreign establishment, foreign policy establishment, is that whether we would like to go in for this kind of engagement at all or not, and whether it will really serve a purpose, because India is a neighbor of China, and if you are talking about a greater military counterpoint, then it has implications. So how will China perceive that? I mean, we are dealing with China at different levels. So if China, Beijing perceives us as militarily, trying to get together with a superpower, US and Japan and Australia, what will be the implications? So these are things that are, I think, a bit worrying for India. But having said that, post Doklam, I think a certain amount of confusion ended in the minds of people who are ambivalent about it. They thought that it's important that you build up an alliance, as Professor Saab says, that something like an Asian NATO.
Right.
But having said that, if you look at every country which is dealing with China, they are working, they are bilaterally trying to be on the right side. Donald Trump goes to China, has a bilateral meeting. they signed deals for $259 billion, and it's not a piddly amount. It's a huge amount, and that will ensure that China and US work together. Look at Shinzo Abe. I mean, he's also part of Quad, and at the end of the meeting, he said that, you know, with Xi Jinping, it's a great meeting. Things worked out rather well, and I'm sure Australia, which is politically rather irrelevant or geopolitically rather irrelevant, and they try to somehow come back into reckoning, they cannot do very much without China.
And all this while the leaders have maintained it's important to keep the politics of a relation and economics of a relation completely in two different segments and or in different compartments. And we have seen, you know, be it Japan or China and US, they share a very, very strong bilateral trade. If one talks about India and China, we have a huge trade deficit with China.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that remains a challenge. But you know, in terms of India's concerns, we already have a productive trilateral relationship between US, India and Japan. What's the need for a Quad arrangement in the first place, the inclusion of Australia? How this helps really India?
I mean, fundamentally it's pertaining to, it started off when it came to Malabar naval exercises, generally trying to ensure that the sea lanes in the Strait of Malacca and the South China Sea remain. I mean, we have been raising also, in fact, we have supported US on the issue of the right to, you know, freedom of navigation. And we talked about, you know, ensuring that China does not stake claim over the South China Sea. Even the use of the term Indo-Pacific is a new formation. It is not something that have been talked about very much in the past. If you look at it, President Donald Trump of the US, all through his trip to Asia has been talking about Indo-Pacific. So surely it would supposed to trouble China quite a bit, because they go by this semantics. They are very, very concerned that, you know, Indian Ocean cannot be called Indian Ocean because it somehow has the impress of India on that. So they want that name to be changed. Similarly, they want to take ownership of the South China Sea because there is China, you know, embedded into the name. So in a certain way, there is a play of semantics which is coming, which is very much in evidence.
And interestingly, we have also seen Japan's plan to actually, you know, associate the European powers also into it. So in fact, there were earlier reports saying that maybe, you know, France and Britain can also be part of this particular Quad arrangement. But what we witnessed in Manila was primarily the talks between officials that happened between these four countries. Is it the unilateralism of China which is actually driving the Asian powers to band together? What are India's concerns, and how important this will be for India at this stage?
I agree that India certainly does not want a confrontation with China. China will perhaps be the biggest economy in about a decade or so. Their military power is increasing. But perhaps most of the countries are adopting a hedging strategy that keep the options open, try to work with China, try to ensure that they do not tread on other people's toes, do not throw their weight around. But in case they continue to do that, then every sovereign country wants to have options. And in that context, the concerns, the perceptions, the worldview of major democracies like United States, Japan, Australia, India, they converge. And in case required, the worldview concerns of European powers will also converge with the worldview of these four powers. So it is a nascent group. I will not go so far to say that it will become a NATO, but this is perhaps a signal to China that please be careful. What are you doing? And your actions are making your neighbors and even countries who are outside the region very nervous. So that is a signal. I think China in their wisdom should heed the signal, and things will remain cooperative, perhaps competitive, but will not become confrontational.
And how you see this impacting the other issues, you know, if one talks about the climate change or trade talks, because where India and China need to work together. We have seen the way President Trump has responded by, you know, moving out of the Paris Agreement. So from that perspective, why it becomes so important for India and China to be on the same page, especially when it comes to addressing the issues, global issues that impact not just India and China, but other nations too. We need the developing economies to be together there.
I think that way, in some areas, some subjects, India and China will continue to work together. Climate change being, because India and China both are convinced in our own assessment that this is a major issue. Whatever America does or does not do, that is a separate issue. But on trade, we and the United States are perhaps on the same page, because we have massive trade deficit against China. China is not an open economy. They have all kinds of hidden subsidies. and they have been able to work the system of WTO, etc., to their huge advantage. Except with Japan and Korea, they have a trade surplus with all their neighboring countries. And with this OBOR and this kind of new initiatives, they will perhaps destroy the manufacturing of all their neighboring countries, which these countries are not fully understanding. Even in Pakistani press, now this kind of articles are coming, that in case the road is built and then there are concessional traffics, etc., are there, then the Pakistani manufacturing will continue, will absolutely disappear. So there are issues on which we can work with China, but most of the issues perhaps we are on a different page. But ultimately, it is that peace and tranquility is required for continued prosperity of East Asia. Look at what is happening to west of India. The whole of West Asia, from Pakistan, Iran, Afghanistan, they are in turmoil. And a huge responsibility lies on China's shoulders as an emerging superpower of this area to ensure that this peace and tranquility remains. And in that, we must have a multipolar system, because if it is unipolar, then it is human nature that one pole will try to dominate over others.
Okay, now Professor Uttam, are we actually seeing a transition of power in the Indo-Pacific, where actually the US power is declining and the Chinese power is actually going up, and that's what Quad security dialogue is trying to retain? Its structure, it's the fact that as you rightly pointed out, a suggestion that came in 2007 and then finally taking shape in 2017. The necessity of this, and also if one has to draw parallel with all that's happening in the South Asian region today, how would you distinguish SAARC as a grouping and ASEAN as a grouping?
Certainly, what you have suggested, that how the entire region is now in a very different level, and considering that India has emerged, if it plays its diplomatic cards well, as a winner, because now India, the Asian countries, they're looking towards India as a balancer. Earlier, during the President Obama, there was a talk of G2. Japan, the US and China, together they run the world. But now the US has moved to balance the China. And India has looking towards how it can play its card to create a balance, or we can say counterbalance. And in that context, Quad arrangement is a very important development, and I think it will enhance India's position. Also, it will give a very important signal to China that they cannot take Asia under what they had before, what they call Chinese world order, and place Asian countries according to their status, where Korea and Vietnam was the tributary state. So I think this development is very important, and India should very carefully look into how the geopolitics is evolving and giving India a space.
So you're saying it further enhances India's strategic position in the area with this development of Quad security dialogue, as the MEA has said that there's great dynamism in economy of India and ASEAN countries. India's bilateral trade and investment remains robust, and India supports ASEAN's unity and centrality in the regional security architecture. So there's a lot of possibilities that exist between India and ASEAN engagement. But on the other side, when we come back, let's look at the challenges from the northeast side. The connectivity between India and ASEAN countries remain a major issue. On the other side, we focus on that. Stay tuned. Welcome back. You're watching Insight. 2 decades ago, Asia was in the grip of a broad economic crisis. Through the 1997-98 Asian financial crisis, regional stock markets lost more than 60% of their value. The recovery that followed the Asian financial crisis had been largely driven by domestic policy reforms, demographics in ASEAN and South Asia, and infrastructure investment in China. From 1997 to 2016, GDP per capita across ASEAN's 6 countries had grown by 155%. For a region as diverse as ASEAN and South Asia, integration is hardly an easy process though. Within ASEAN alone, the difference between GDP per capita in Singapore and Cambodia is as big as 55 times. There continues to be insufficient infrastructure, inconsistent regulations and trade barriers. The region is in dire need of infrastructure development. The Asian Development Bank estimates that South Asia and Southeast Asia will need at least $3.6 trillion from 2010 to 2020 in infrastructure investment to meet the needs of the growing populations in the two regions. So what limitations exist within the ASEAN region? Our focus now. Coming back to you, before we talk about the limitations, let's try and also understand how SAARC as a grouping is different from ASEAN as a grouping.
Fundamentally, SAARC, I think at some stage tried to replicate the success of ASEAN. And it's an idea which is there, but I had never really bloomed, primarily because SAARC countries, there is a major conflict which still has to be resolved, and that is between India and Pakistan. Until the time that conflict gets resolved, many of the issues which have proved to be success for ASEAN, whether it is connectivity, whether it is trade, the intra-country trade in the SAARC region is abysmal, and there is a recognition that if the region has to develop, you need to lower the barrier, free the trade, and you keep on reading about the conflict that is there between India and Pakistan on trade issues. I mean, time and again, the Pakistanis resent the idea of giving most favored nation to us, and similarly, things just come to a standstill. I remember in one of the SAARC summit, you had a leader from Maldives actually pleading that you should stop fighting or talking about contentious issues like Kashmir and all that, because I've attended many SAARC summit and I have realized that the entire agenda is hijacked by the conflict, and there is no real issue that really takes off. So whether it is the issue of climate change, trade, everything has not really have not been able to realize its potential. So in a certain way, SAARC as an entity is there, but its idea will start taking off only when the bilateral issues are sorted out between the countries.
Okay, so in a way, are you also saying that ASEAN comparatively there's less conflict and more cohesion?
I think whatever conflict there might have been between, say for example, Thailand and Myanmar and Thailand and Laos, over a period of time they have settled down. So there is a certain amount of ease of movement and ease of doing business which is manifesting itself. So there were for example, you had some Islamic terror and insurgency issues in southern Thailand, for instance, or even some turbulence in Indonesia. They got sorted out. I mean, they have been contained quite a bit. So there is, I think, a certain climate which has been created in that region where it becomes easy to talk business, easy to engage in activities which will promote the overall well-being of the people.
Okay. Professor Uttam, one has to understand SAARC vis-a-vis ASEAN as a grouping. We always say that it's Pakistan which has literally hijacked the SAARC grouping, and the sort of security threat emanates not from an outsider but from our own neighbors. So regional security architecture is completely, is not there in the case of the South Asian Association of Regional Cooperation. But if one looks at it from from a different perspective and looks at ASEAN, is there less collision and more consensus in this region? Do you see a greater integration among ASEAN countries than vis-a-vis the SAARC grouping?
Yeah, it's sure. Actually, the Asian countries, they have one very important glue, and that glue is the very powerful overseas Chinese capital. That these, like Indonesia, there are this the dominant capital is under the Chinese control. In Malaysia also, even in Thailand, in Singapore, so that capital actually forms a core, and around which the other entrepreneurs of the other ethnic groups, let's say Malays and all these, they are coming together. However, in the South Asia, we don't have that kind of capital that integrates all countries despite the political differences. So we are bogged down by the bilateral problems, and we are not able to initiate the multilateral dialogue that can actually stabilize this grouping. So I think the time for SAARC
Okay,
has
so
not
there's
yet
a
come.
missing leadership also in the SAARC grouping, because if one looks at India, there are different perceptions how Nepal is viewing India, or how Maldives or Sri Lanka is looking at India. You know, we have heard this for long. If there's a big brother attitude vis-a-vis, you know, because China, if one looks at China within ASEAN countries, China is seen with a lot of suspicion, and that's another reason that China has not been able to, you know, if one looks at the bilaterals which China has with other Southeast Asian countries, is it really at par with the sort of bonhomie which India enjoys with many of these East Asian neighbors?
Yeah, actually, the China factor is also becoming very important in the SAARC grouping, because now Pakistan, after that Nepal, even Bangladesh, they now look towards their capital requirements, because we are all capital importing countries. So we look towards China now to solve the problem.
Okay.
However, China has no interest that the SAARC should prosper and India should be undisputed leader of this grouping. So I think, considering this, the capital dimension, that the Chinese capital, as it is now dominating the Southeast Asia, it is going to dominate the SAARC countries.
Okay, okay. Ambassador Tal, that's an important point. It's the capital domination which is finally calling the shots, that who is, even if, you know, China is not, China has a pseudo presence in all these countries. Look at Malaysia, look at Indonesia, look at Singapore. You know, the way it has actually invested through its capital, and the similar is happening also in the South Asian region. We have seen Nepal, Sri Lanka looking towards China, and many of these countries also playing a bargaining chip with India on many of these deals when they you know, when they are looking for India's support, and then vis-a-vis playing the same project to China. Also, are we now you know, in a very difficult phase in terms of how we should be engaging with the ASEAN countries, seeing the growth of China here?
I think we are in a difficult phase, because all these countries, which is very natural, they want to promote their own self-interest. And if we look at that India-ASEAN or China-ASEAN engagement is mostly economic and keep the security aspect aside, then what are the ASEAN countries looking for? They want market for their own goods, or they want investments from other countries. And China has somehow in their manufacturing chain, many countries of ASEAN are quite well integrated. Like Malaysia, you know, their computers, the motherboards come from Malaysia. Thailand also. So in their value chain, some ASEAN countries are well integrated with China. China, of course, is coming as a major investor and also as a major market. And there we have to be realistic. We cannot match China. So we have to come with something else. And what we are coming with is human resources development. We are doing a lot in CMLV countries, Cambodia, Myanmar, Laos and Vietnam. For their, we give thousands of scholarships, iTech program, human resource development, and that is where we have an advantage. We have a comparative advantage as far as China is concerned. But so we should not look at this relationship as a sort of a competition with China. We should look at India-ASEAN relations which stand on their own merit, which have a very strong logic in India's Act East policy, and earlier Thailand had look West policy. If we look at our own Northeast, their prosperity, their development will be much faster if they integrate.
You know, if one looks at the very creation of ASEAN and the fact that it was based at regional integration and based on 3 pillars: political, security, economics and socio-cultural ties, from that perspective, if one looks at ASEAN today, connectivity remains a major challenge for India. In fact, many of the projects which we have you know, promised, you know, if one starts from Myanmar, it's still you know, it's not really at a stage where we can say that we have delivered those projects. So implementation remains a challenge from the Indian side, where actually China scores a point, because China has delivered projects, the promised projects which it has made, the promises it has made to many of the neighbors.
Unfortunately, this remains a weak point. The trilateral highway between our Manipur, then Myanmar towards Bangkok, Thailand, that is still not complete, and now the date has been pushed back to 2020. There are some very enormous engineering challenges in Myanmar particularly, but then we should try to get the help of Japan and South Korea. They have very good engineering skills. They have their own aid programs, assistance programs with Myanmar, and I think in the latest agreements with Prime Minister Abe, it has been mentioned how Japan can help in the development of our northeast and this further connectivity.
Okay.
So connectivity remains a challenge, and we have not been able to implement it as rapidly as we should, and we must concentrate on that.
Okay, we have not really delivered, the way we should have actually. Professor Uttam, how this really affects the credibility, when we talk about implementing projects and we don't really deliver on time vis-a-vis, because we are comparing ourselves and the promises we are making, with another superpower, that's of course China, and China has delivered many of these projects.
Yeah, I think it is very important that for India to match China in terms of infrastructure development, in terms of investment, may not be possible. That's we have to understand this reality and then see what India can do. Actually, India has a very important leverage. That is not the security, not the economy, but the culture.
Okay.
Like India has many cultural ties that go well beyond the modern times, and if we use those cultural ties, I think India can become a new balancer by using these ties and exercising it's a soft power, because many countries now they are facing the challenge that Asia may go under Chinese hegemony, and they don't want that. And so India should come up with more cultural products, and our service industry is very powerful.
Okay.
And so in ASEAN we have to find our niche, and our niche is that we should develop cultural ties and we should expand our Bollywood.
Okay.
And I think that way India will be a new balancer and more acceptable power than China.
So focus more on strengths, do a SWOT analysis and see that what is it that you can get as far as this region is concerned. And if China is actually emerging as a big power in terms of the sort of checkbook diplomacy it does with many of these nations, the potential where India can work, and the panelist here feels one, of course, can be a strong area, that is the cultural ties. So on the other side, in our final segment, we'll ask what really is the way forward, and how far India has travelled from its earlier days of Look East policy to today's Act East policy. In the final segment, stay tuned. Welcome back. You're watching Insight. ASEAN reinforces the importance of 3 C's: connectivity, commerce and culture. The ASEAN-India connectivity is a matter of strategic priority for India, as also the ASEAN countries. India has also been working with ASEAN to enhance physical connectivity via its northeast. India's bid to seek further ties with ASEAN nations comes at a time when China is being increasingly assertive. From Look East to Act East, how far India has travelled in its relation. Coming back to you, Ambassador Tayal, on this. The Prime Minister is there to attend the ASEAN Summit and also the East Asia Summit. If you can quickly just elaborate on the agenda of how East Asia Summit's agenda is any different from the ASEAN Summit.
Before that, one point on this cultural connectivity is very, very important, what Professor Uttam mentioned. And we have a civilizational connection which is very, very important with all Southeast Asian countries. Today, after the ASEAN inauguration in the cultural program, Ramayana, there was one performance on Ramayana, the interpretation, the Filipino interpretation of Ramayana, which is wonderful. And in our Act East, we are now going full steam for Nalanda, revival of Nalanda University. Right. It has already started functioning in Rajgiri. So that is another part of the story. East Asia Summit will focus more on security issues, and it is. If we look at Prime Minister Modi's speech in Vientiane last year, he had made a very frontal attack without naming Pakistan on Pakistan, and he had called that one should isolate and sanction the instigator of global terrorism. So that, because he'll take the cue from President Duterte, who also said fundamentalism and the radicalization in the area.
Right.
So that would be one theme, and of course the security and the lines of communications, that there should be unimpeded. There should not be any kind of restriction in South China Sea and elsewhere. And then the new threats which are emerging, cyber security will become a major threat, because perhaps the next war will be a very different kind of war, which will have total deniability. So all these issues will be discussed.
So India's preparedness also in the area of cyber warfare, and that's been on agenda for many countries. A final word on the program, last 5 minutes. Something which we actually missed was Philippines, where it is being organized. India-Philippines ties, and the fact that Prime Minister is also visiting, many important places. Has already visited many important places in Philippines. The most important is the Rice Institute. How do you look at this particular association and the ties which India shares with Philippines?
I think this is the first time Indian Prime Minister going in 36 years, so surely the ties aren't really great, and I'm sure things start picking up. There is a proposal for International Rice Institute to start. It's already been approved by the Government of India to have another center in Varanasi.
Right.
Secondly, for the first time, I think India has supported Philippines to take on Islamic terror. We not only shared intelligence, but also I think we gave some hardware. But in that, I think China also supported. So it's something that we all both converged, that Philippines has to be bailed out from this very horrific attack that these people launched, and they took over the city within no time. So I think there was recognition that something like this could happen in any country, and it had to be nipped in the bud. So India provided hardware. So these are beginning of a better relationship between the two countries. But Philippines is also poor, and it's always been very close to United States of America. They have had problems of all kinds with the US. So I'm sure there would be a lot that Prime Minister Modi and President Duterte, who has a reputation of being an extremely tough man, would have to share, both in terms of running their country and sharing notes on how they...
And the fact this is a very historic visit also. 50 years of establishment of the ASEAN, 25 years of India-ASEAN dialogue partnership, 15 years of summit level participation, and 5 years of India's strategic partnership with ASEAN. If one looks at from the Indian perspective, for today for India, the biggest challenge, of course, is terrorism and extremism. What potential you see in ASEAN countries together? Because all this while we are saying that diplomatically isolate Pakistan. Here at a forum like this, we are asking for a globally crafted policy where countries can come together and tackle terrorism. What potential you see in ASEAN?
One thing I like to add besides the threat of terror is also economic slowdown, how to improve growth, how to fight poverty. And I think that is that if you are able to do all that, we'll be able to fight terrorism far better than we would do otherwise. So, but crafting a challenge to counter terror will come through sharing of intelligence, sharing of movement of all these terror groups which takes place. And I think we all have benefited quite a bit in terms of knowing exactly the threat that keeps coming up. As I mentioned earlier about how India was quick to offer support on clamping down on the threat which was rearing its head in Philippines. It's not yet over, but still I think there has been a great amount of coordinated effort. So I think in a certain way there is a possibility of greater cooperation. It is working. But as I said, more importantly, it has to do with how do you perk up your economy, make it as fast as the rest of the economy, because the first time was happening that there is a slowdown in India in comparison to other economies which are doing far better. There's been a global uptick in growth, but we have kind of taking...
Okay, so you're saying greater cooperation and collaboration within nations can actually be a big solution or a big driver towards tackling terrorism also. Final word on the program, from Look East policy to Act East, how far India has travelled?
I think India has made tremendous achievement by operationalizing the idea of East. So the government has actually addressed this issue by cultural lens. As I mentioned before, we have organized conferences between India and Korea, because an Indian princess from Ayodhya went and married in Korea. Then there has been conferences with other countries of ASEAN, reviving our old links, and through which we should find how to operationalize. Because talking big is simple, but how finding the threads and then moving on is difficult, and I think that the government is focusing on by instituting the Act East policy.
Okay, so picking common threads, and Bodh Gaya remains an important symbol. The way I've seen the way many of the East Asian leaders have also visited. Final word on the program from you, Ambassador Tayal. What's really is the way forward for India-ASEAN ties?
I think the level of engagement has deepened a lot. In the last 3 years, our president or vice president or prime minister have visited all the 10 ASEAN countries, as well as, of course, we have annual summits with Japan and China.
Right.
So there is a great deal of engagement. There is a lot of appreciation. India is a accepted power, accepted as a friend. Nobody is wary of India. That is a big plus which we have as compared to some other countries.
Okay.
And now it is for us, all of us together, and Prime Minister Modi will try to work with other leaders to take it forward, to build on a very good foundation which exists.
Okay, you
One last word is that for the first time we are inviting all the ASEAN leaders to come for the
That's right.
26th January celebration. There will be a India-ASEAN summit which will happen on sometime in January, immediately after Republic Day. So I think in a certain way we are cementing that relationship.
Right, so 10 heads of state actually will
Yeah,
be
this
attending
is very
the
unusual,
Republic
yeah.
Day parade, and that's a big
Really,
opportunity.
so I thought I must add this. Yeah.
Yes, and an important opportunity also in terms of building the India-ASEAN ties. And that's all we have for you in this edition of Insight. Thanks very much, all of you, for joining us on this program. Thanks very much for watching.